the summer of 1944. Across Europe, every soldier knew the name Normandy. But while the world watched the Allied army storm Hitler's western defenses, a hidden storm was building in the east. A storm so violent, it would wipe entire German armies off the map and shatter Nazi dreams forever. This was not just a battle. It was a cataclysm. In one swift stroke, over 2 million Soviet soldiers crashed through Germany's defenses, with 100,000 shells raining every minute. Cities burned to black ash, armies vanished in the marshes, and even the most loyal generals begged for mercy as their men were surrounded and erased. But the true story wasn't only about tanks and gunfire. It was about power, pride, and the deadly mistake of trusting one man, Adolf Hitler, to control every move from hundreds of miles away. His fanatic orders, stand fast, no retreat, die in place, transformed villages and rivers into graveyards for his own troops. Why did so many German soldiers perish? Why did a whole army group simply vanish? And what secret lessons does this forgotten disaster teach us about leadership in war today? This is Operation Bagration, the battle that broke Hitler's Eastern Front and changed the fate of Europe in just 6 weeks. In the next few minutes, you'll witness the chaos, courage, and tragedy of the Eastern Front's deadliest summer. From hopeless heroism to command paralysis, discover why Operation Bagration wasn't just another offensive. It was the fatal error that sealed Germany's defeat in the East. In the shadows of Normandy's beaches, while the West braced for liberation, something even more devastating stirred in the East. The summer of 1944 did not just bring the world the might of D-Day, it summoned a storm that would break the very backbone of Hitler's Eastern dreams. Operation Bagration. Imagine the Eastern Front, a jagged scar stretching from the cold Baltic Sea in the north to the blazing Black Sea in the south. At its heart, the German Army Group Center, holding a fragile bulge in Belarus. This army group was Hitler's pride, a symbol that the Reich could still dominate. But to experienced eyes, that bulge looked like a trap waiting to spring. By spring 1944, Hitler's war machine was worn thin. Army Group Center was outnumbered, surrounded by enemies hungry for revenge after years of brutal occupation. But at Hitler's map table, far from the mud and blood, the story was different. He believed the real Soviet threat was to the south, towards Ukraine and Romania. Belarus? Just a quiet sector. Invincible. Secure. His generals frowned, worrying over the maps, sensing doom. But their voices were drowned by his fanatic orders. Hold the line. No retreat, no surrender. In Berlin, flexible defense was not strategy. It was blasphemy. While German headquarters clung to illusions, a storm was building. Stalin knew his moment had come. Soviet deception teams wove elaborate lies, feeding German spies with false clues. Dummy tanks, fake signals, whispers of a southern offensive. The real hammer would land right where the enemy felt safest. By June, the Red Army massed in trembling forests east of Army Group Center. Over 2.3 million soldiers. Thousands of tanks. Artillery enough to shatter the earth. For Soviet fronts, led by marshals whose names would echo in history, prepared to descend like a tidal wave. Zhukov, Rokossovsky, Bagramyan, Cherniakovsky. Across a front 900 kilometers wide, fewer than 800,000 German soldiers braced for impact. Their defenses were strong in places, crumbling in others. But above it all loomed the doctrine of stand fast. Even as recon pilots warned of Soviet troops pouring in, Hitler's response was as solid as concrete. Stand firm. Fight to the last bullet. The die was cast. On June 22, 1944, the earth itself seemed to shatter. At dawn, the sky erupted. Soviet artillery unleashed a bombardment so fierce that trenches and bunkers vanished in flame and soil. Over 100,000 shells fell every minute. Radios fell silent. Men buried their heads and prayed, not for victory but for survival. In those first hours, entire German sectors simply ceased to exist. Communications collapsed, supply lines shredded by Soviet bombers. Isolated units, once proud, now leaderless, clung to patches of mud, still believing relief would come. But Bagration was not just a blitz. It was a noose tightening with every hour. General after general pleaded with Hitler's headquarters for permission to fall back, to regroup, to save their men from certain doom. The reply was always the same. Hold every inch. Defend to the death. In the steel rain, a single stubborn command became a death sentence for tens of thousands. The fate of Army Group Center was sealed before the Soviets even crossed the first river. But in Berlin, the depth of the disaster was still hidden, masked by arrogance, denial, and the tyranny of one man's will. The dawn of June 22, 1944, shattered all illusions. As Soviet guns thundered, the German lines buckled beneath a storm of steel. Trenches disappeared in fire and smoke, bunkers filled with deafening blasts and choking dust. Soldiers who survived the initial bombardment found themselves cut off from their commanders, desperate for orders that never came. Every minute, more Red Army troops surged forward, pouring through gaps where fortresses once stood. The skies were owned by Soviet bombers and fighters, shredding convoys and rail lines, isolating whole sectors. In Vitebsk, Hitler had declared the city a fortress, to be held at any cost. General Friedrich Gallwitzer obeyed, pinning his faith on reinforcements that never arrived. Surrounded by 5 Soviet armies, his garrison was trapped. 30,000 men doomed to fight with no hope, wiped out in days. South at Orsha, the famous 78th Sturm Division, one of Germany's last veteran units, was flanked and pinned, yet forbidden to retreat. Hitler's orders, relayed from far behind the front, were absolute: no step backward. The division was annihilated within 48 hours. It wasn't just Soviet fire that killed these men, it was a chain of orders forged in arrogance and denial. As the Red Army swept forward, chaos grew behind German lines. Berlin's commands contradicted each other, communications collapsed. Junior officers found themselves forced to stand fast, even as their positions were overrun. Field Marshal Ernst Busch, commanding Army Group Center, reported firm resistance to Hitler, even after entire corps simply ceased to exist. When news of encirclements reached Hitler's headquarters, his rage found easy targets. Generals accused of defeatism, soldiers blamed for lacking will to victory. In his mind, the front lines were still intact, mere lines on a map, divorced from reality. By June 26, the Soviets had reached the Berezina River, slicing through rear lines, cutting off retreat and supply. Army Group Center, once Hitler's hammer, was disintegrating. In the swamps and forests, isolated German units tried to flee. Those denied permission to withdraw simply vanished. Abandoned vehicles, burned uniforms, ghosts blending into the marshes. The catastrophe reached its climax at Bobruisk. Here, General Hans Jordan's 9th Army faced not one but 2 converging Soviet front attacks. Jordan pleaded with Busch for permission to pull back, fearing total disaster. But Busch, terrified of Hitler's wrath, refused. The Führer forbids withdrawal. Days later, Jordan's army was encircled. Soviet artillery turned Bobruisk into a graveyard. Of the 100,000 men trapped within the city, fewer than 5,000 survived. For the German Eastern Front, this was not just defeat, it was annihilation. Yet even as the catastrophe unfolded, Hitler clung to illusions. The situation can be stabilized, he told his staff. We will counterattack. He dismissed Field Marshal Busch not for his slavish obedience, but for lacking faith. His replacement, Walter Model, arrived to a wasteland, burning towns, columns of refugees, and no front left to defend. Model, pragmatic and ruthless, did what Hitler had forbidden. He ordered a broad retreat without waiting for permission, sending vague reports of temporary regrouping to Berlin. His actions salvaged fragments of Germany's broken armies, preventing even greater loss. But the tragedy of Bagration was complete, the damage irreversible. As Soviet tanks thundered west, Hitler issued new orders: Minsk must not be given up. The fate of the Eastern Front depends on it. But when Model protested that the city was indefensible, Hitler accused him of defeatism. On July 3, the Soviets crashed into the outskirts of Minsk. Over 100,000 German troops were taken prisoner. The collapse rolled on, liberating all of Belarus and reaching the borders of East Prussia. 6 weeks. 600 kilometers. Nearly 500,000 German soldiers killed, wounded, or captured. In Berlin, the myth of the invincible Wehrmacht died in the marshes of Belarus. As July 1944 faded, the echoes of Operation Bagration reverberated far beyond the fields of Belarus. The Soviet advance didn't stop at Minsk, it cascaded west, unhinging Germany's entire eastern front. The road to Warsaw, the Baltic, and even Berlin now lay dangerously exposed. The Wehrmacht, once feared and celebrated, had been gutted, not by Soviet numbers alone, but by a toxic mix of arrogance, paralysis, and blind obedience. In Berlin, Hitler retreated further into delusion. Reports of wiped-out divisions and cities lost were met with fits of rage and elaborate denials. The situation is temporary, he insisted. We will counterattack and restore the front. But there were no longer enough fuel, men, or reserves left to fill the gaps. With Army Group Center obliterated, Germany's ability to defend the East collapsed. Vital divisions in France were pulled back desperately, just as the Allies broke out from Normandy. The Nazi war machine, stretched thin, began to break, one front after another. What made Operation Bagration so uniquely devastating wasn't just the scale, it was the blueprint for disaster. For years, Hitler clung to his doctrine of no retreat. Strategic withdrawal, which might have saved tens of thousands, was forbidden. Tactical flexibility, the ability to read the battlefield and act quickly, became heresy. Veteran commanders fell silent, afraid of punishment, afraid of being labeled defeatist. Hitler insisted that willpower alone could hold the line, even as his army's strength bled away. Strongholds weren't shields, they were traps. The consequences rippled through every German soldier's life. Young men were left in hopeless cities labeled fortresses, Vitebsk, Orsha, Mogilev, Bobruisk, and then Minsk. They dug in and waited for relief, knowing none would come. Survivors who escaped faced a retreat through burning forests, swamps littered with wreckage and the dead. The myth of German invincibility was buried alongside its men. But for the Soviets, Operation Bagration was vindication and vengeance. It avenged the Red Army's earlier disasters and proved the Soviet capacity for modern, coordinated warfare. Stalin's armies had learned, adapted, and now outmaneuvered their enemy at every turn, using deception, overwhelming firepower, and relentless speed. In the years since, military historians have often returned to Bagration, not just as a story of Soviet victory, but as a case study in what happens when command becomes tyranny. Communications between Hitler's headquarters and the front were slow, contradictory, and paralyzed by fear. Orders to stand fast led entire units directly into encirclements. The legendary German initiative, once the pride of Blitzkrieg, had suffocated under the weight of ideology. Soldiers fought heroically, but they were forbidden, even from saving themselves. The aftermath of Bagration reopened wounds and forced bitter reflection. The collapse of Army Group Center gave the Allies momentum from every direction, accelerating the Nazi defeat. It showed that no army, no matter how skilled or motivated, could survive centralized command divorced from battlefield reality. Hitler's insistence on controlling every decision turned strategy into disaster, and cost tens of thousands their lives. Today, Operation Bagration stands out not only as one of WWII's greatest military offensives, but as a warning for generations. It is remembered as the day arrogance met planning, and dictatorship met reality, the day the forests and marshes of Belarus became the grave of German pride. In the silence that followed, the lesson remains. No matter how strong the will, a leader's refusal to adapt will turn courage into catastrophe. The victors were those who listened, learned, and led. The defeated were the ones who obeyed blindly, until the end.